It was a chilly Monday morning in New York City, and the bustling courthouse was already alive with heated debates and serious legal matters. The Honorable Judge Margaret Sullivan, known for her no-nonsense demeanor and razor-sharp rulings, took her seat at the bench ready to oversee another day of justice. Among the cases on her docket was a seemingly trivial matter that had everyone in the courtroom smirking. Mr. Rowan Bean, a quirky, awkward man with an infamous reputation for clumsiness, had been brought to court for allegedly violating a new city ordinance against wearing religious symbols in government buildings. Mr. Bean, as always, was dressed in his signature tweed jacket, brown trousers, and a slightly confused expression. But today, there was one additional accessory, a simple silver cross necklace dangling over his sweater vest. As the court clerk read out the charges, whispers spread across the room. Some found the entire situation absurd, while others were genuinely curious to see how the notorious Mr. Bean would handle himself in a courtroom. Mr. Rowan Bean, Judge Sullivan's voice cut through the chatter, you are being charged with violating City Ordinance 52A, which prohibits the display of religious symbols in government buildings. How do you plead? Mr. Bean blinked at the judge, then at his own necklace, and finally back at the judge. He scratched his head, seemingly lost in thought, before he slowly leaned into the microphone. Not guilty, he said, his voice lilting into a question as if unsure of the words himself. The judge sighed and rubbed her temples. You were caught on camera entering this very courthouse with a visible cross necklace. The law is clear. You are in violation. I'm fining you $500. Case closed. A collective gasp spread through the courtroom. The fine was unusually steep for such a minor infraction, and even the prosecutor seemed taken aback. But what shocked everyone more was what happened next. Mr. Bean, who usually fumbled his way through the simplest tasks, suddenly straightened his posture and smirked. Objection, Your Honor, he said. The courtroom went silent. Judge Sullivan narrowed her eyes. Mr. Bean, you are not an attorney. Objection, Mr. Bean repeated, now adjusting his tie in a way that made him look oddly confident. But I do have the right to represent myself, don't I? The judge frowned. You do, but Then Mr. Bean interrupted, I'd like to present my defense. At that moment, something shifted. The spectators, the lawyers, even the bailiffs, everyone leaned forward. This was no longer just a routine case. Mr. Bean, the man known for bumbling through life with a childlike innocence, was now standing tall, exuding an air of intelligence and mystery. And then, to everyone's utter disbelief, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a set of reading glasses, and slipped them onto his nose. It was a subtle act, but it changed everything. Ladies and gentlemen, he continued, now pacing like a seasoned attorney, what we have here is not just a case of me wearing a cross necklace. No. What we have here is a violation of my constitutional rights. The murmurs in the courtroom grew. The judge looked slightly irritated, but also intrigued. Proceed, she said, folding her hands in front of her. Mr. Bean grinned, and with a dramatic flourish, he pulled out a thick legal book, the United States Constitution. Your Honor, he said, flipping through the pages, I would like to direct your attention to the First Amendment. And with that, the entire courtroom held its breath. Mr. Bean adjusted his reading glasses and cleared his throat. The entire courtroom sat in stunned silence as he began to read from the Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. He paused for effect, looking up at Judge Sullivan with a newfound intensity. Your Honor, the First Amendment clearly protects my right to express my religious beliefs. This cross necklace, he said, holding up the small silver pendant for the court to see, is a symbol of my faith. By fining me, the city is directly violating my constitutional right to free religious expression. The judge arched an eyebrow. Mr. Bean, the ordinance exists to maintain neutrality in government spaces. We cannot appear to endorse any religion. But I am not the government, Your Honor, Mr. Bean said smoothly. I'm just a citizen. The government isn't endorsing my religion, I am. And punishing me for this is what the courts call viewpoint discrimination. Surely, as a constitutional scholar like yourself knows, the Supreme Court has ruled against such discrimination repeatedly. A murmur spread across the courtroom. The prosecuting attorney, a young, ambitious man named Mr. Phillips, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. No one had expected Mr. Bean to come armed with actual legal arguments, let alone accurate ones. Objection, Mr. Phillips said, rising. Mr. Bean is, well, Your Honor, he's Mr. Bean. How can we take his legal argument seriously? Judge Sullivan shot him a sharp look. I'll decide what is serious, Mr. Phillips. She turned back to Mr. Bean. Continue. Mr. Bean smiled as though he'd been waiting for this moment. Your Honor, may I approach the bench? Judge Sullivan hesitated but eventually nodded. Proceed. With an exaggerated yet oddly graceful walk, Mr. Bean crossed the courtroom and placed a neatly organized legal brief in front of her. I have prepared a full argument citing Tinker v. Des Moines, West Virginia State Board of Education v. Barnett and Burwell v. Hobby Lobby, all cases in which the court affirmed the right to religious expression against government interference. The judge's eyes widened slightly as she flipped through the pages. It was flawless, meticulously argued, with case law references and constitutional citations. How did you prepare this?" she asked, genuinely bewildered. Mr. Bean flashed his trademark goofy smile. "I like to read. Helps pass the time." Phillips, now clearly panicked, scrambled to find a counterargument. "Your Honor, the city's intent wasn't to restrict religious freedom, it was to maintain neutrality. Mr. Bean's antics can't undermine city law." Mr. Bean didn't miss a beat. "Your Honor, the Constitution is not a suggestion. It's the supreme law of the land. And no city ordinance can override my federal rights." The judge sighed and leaned back in her chair, clearly struggling with the unexpected intellectual force that Mr. Bean had become. "You're suggesting the ordinance itself is unconstitutional?" "Yes, Your Honor," Mr. Bean said, his voice firm. "And I respectfully request that the fine be dismissed and the ordinance be struck down." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Was it possible? Could Mr. Bean, a man best known for losing his pants in public and causing chaos at Christmas, actually dismantle a city law? Judge Sullivan held up a hand, quieting the room. "I'll need to review your brief and the city's arguments. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning." As the gavel came down, Mr. Bean turned and walked back to his seat. But not before winking at Mr. Phillips, who looked like he was about to faint. The crowd buzzed as the courtroom emptied, many glancing back at Mr. Bean in awe. Was he truly a legal genius? Or had the world simply underestimated him? One thing was certain, this case was far from over. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread across New York City that the bumbling Mr. Bean had somehow transformed into a legal mastermind. Reporters lined the back rows, cameras flashed outside the courthouse, and social media buzzed with hashtags like #Bean versus the system and #LegalGeniusBean. At precisely 9 a.m., Judge Sullivan entered the room, her expression unreadable. She gavelled the court into session and adjusted her glasses before addressing the room. "I have thoroughly reviewed both Mr. Bean's brief and the city's argument. I must say," she paused, scanning the courtroom before settling her gaze on Mr. Bean. "I am impressed by the quality of your legal research, Mr. Bean." Mr. Bean offered an exaggerated bow, drawing a few chuckles from the audience. "But," the judge continued sternly, "before I make a ruling, I want to give the city one last opportunity to justify the constitutionality of this ordinance." "Mr. Phillips, proceed." The young prosecutor stood up, visibly flustered. His usually pristine suit seemed tighter, and a bead of sweat glistened on his brow. He adjusted his tie nervously before addressing the court. "Your Honor, the city's intent is to maintain neutrality. By allowing individuals to display religious symbols in government buildings, we risk creating an environment where citizens feel excluded or marginalized." Mr. Bean immediately stood. "Permission to cross-examine?" he asked innocently. Judge Sullivan hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Proceed." Mr. Bean ambled to the center of the courtroom with an air of mischief. "Mr. Phillips," he began, "are you saying the city wants to prevent all personal expressions in government buildings?" "Yes," Phillips replied hesitantly. "That's the intent." "Ah!" Mr. Bean exclaimed, pulling a remote control from his jacket pocket. With a dramatic click, the court's television screen blinked to life. What followed was a slideshow of images he had clearly prepared in advance. The first image, a security guard at City Hall wearing a rainbow pride pin. The second, a courthouse clerk sporting a political campaign button. And finally, a picture of Judge Sullivan herself, taken only days ago, wearing a gold Star of David on a delicate chain. The courtroom gasped in unison. Even the judge seemed momentarily speechless. Mr. Bean turned back toward Phillips with an innocent smile. "So, does the ordinance only apply to me?" Phillips stammered. "That's different, those aren't overt displays like a cross necklace." "Ah," Mr. Bean said, his tone dripping with playful sarcasm. "Selective enforcement. I believe the legal term is viewpoint discrimination, Your Honor." Judge Sullivan pressed her lips together, clearly displeased. Whether with Mr. Bean or the city's sloppy handling of the case was anyone's guess. "Mr. Phillips," she said, her voice cold, "do you have a legitimate rebuttal?" The young prosecutor, now visibly pale, shuffled through his papers. Finding nothing substantial, he finally shook his head. "No, Your Honor." With a sigh, Judge Sullivan turned her attention back to Mr. Bean. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Mr. Bean? Grinning like a schoolboy who had just outsmarted his teacher, Mr. Bean nodded and approached the bench once more. I'd like to enter one final exhibit into evidence, he said, carefully placing a framed law degree on the judge's desk. Judge Sullivan leaned forward and squinted. It read, Rowan Bean, Juris Doctor, Yale Law School, Class of 2010. A wave of disbelief swept the courtroom. Reporters scrambled to record the revelation. Philip's jaw nearly hit the floor. You're a lawyer? Judge Sullivan asked, eyes wide. Surprise! Mr. Bean quipped. I graduated with honors. I just don't like to brag. You, Philip sputtered, struggling to form words. You've been a lawyer this whole time? Well, I did lose my license briefly for accidentally sending a judge a box of rubber ducks instead of legal documents, Mr. Bean admitted sheepishly. But you know mistakes happen. The judge pinched the bridge of her nose, muttering something under her breath before delivering her verdict. Given the city's failure to apply the ordinance uniformly and considering Mr. Bean's excellent constitutional argument, I am dismissing the fine and declaring the ordinance unconstitutional. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Mr. Bean did a small victory dance complete with jazz hands. And, Mr. Bean, Judge Sullivan added with a smirk, while your legal genius is unorthodox, I would advise you to stick to the law and leave the theatrics to Broadway. Mr. Bean gave another bow. Thank you, Your Honor. I'll take it under advisement. As court adjourned, the press swarmed him. Mr. Bean, what's next for you? One reporter shouted. Well, he said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully, I'm thinking of offering legal services for the clumsy and confused. After all, who better to represent them? With that, he strutted out of the courtroom, head held high, cross necklace gleaming in the sunlight, leaving everyone wondering, had Mr. Bean been a genius all along? The moment Mr. Bean stepped out of the courthouse, he was bombarded by a swarm of flashing cameras and eager reporters. Microphones crowded around his face as journalists from major networks like CNN, Fox News, and NBC jostled for his attention. Mr. Bean, did you really graduate from Yale Law School? One reporter called out. Is it true you outsmarted the city's entire legal team? Another asked, nearly tripping over a cameraman. Mr. Bean gave them all a sheepish smile. Well, he said, adjusting his cross necklace, it's not about outsmarting people. It's about doing what's right. And today, the Constitution won, not just for me, but for everyone who believes in freedom. The crowd erupted into applause. For a man who once got his head stuck inside a turkey on Christmas, Mr. Bean was suddenly being hailed as a hero of free speech. One particularly persistent reporter from the New York Times pushed her way to the front. Mr. Bean, people are calling you a legal genius. How did you manage to present such a compelling case? Mr. Bean tapped the side of his head with a playful wink. Lots of bedtime reading, he said. That and I've always been a bit detail-oriented. As if to prove his point, he bent down to pick up a loose button that had fallen from the prosecutor's jacket during the trial and handed it back to a bewildered Mr. Phillips who stood scowling at the courthouse steps. The media frenzy only intensified when social media exploded with clips from the courtroom. The hashtags #Bean versus the system and #Cross of Justice began trending worldwide, and memes of Mr. Bean holding up the Constitution like a superhero circulated across every platform. One particularly viral post read, Mr. Bean went from losing his teddy bear to dismantling unconstitutional laws. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Despite the media chaos, Mr. Bean remained as humble and awkward as ever. As he walked down the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed furiously in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out and blinked at the screen, a dozen missed calls from prestigious law firms wanting to hire him. Blimey, he muttered under his breath. They must really like my handwriting. Yet, among the congratulatory messages, one stood out, a personal invitation from Professor Eleanor Wexler, the nation's leading constitutional scholar, requesting Mr. Bean to speak at an upcoming Harvard Law Symposium on civil liberties. Harvard? Mr. Bean whispered to himself, his eyes widening in disbelief. Me? Oh, dear. But before he could process the enormity of it all, a familiar voice called out from behind him. Mr. Bean. He turned to see Sophie Harper, a sharp, no-nonsense civil rights attorney who had been watching the case closely. She stood with a leather briefcase in one hand and a curious glint in her eyes. I've got a proposition for you, she said, stepping closer. The city's ordinance was just the beginning. Across the country, people are facing fines and penalties for expressing their beliefs. What if we teamed up to challenge these laws nationwide? Mr. Bean's face lit up with excitement, and perhaps a hint of mischief. You mean, more courtrooms? More legal loopholes to uncover? Sophie laughed. Something like that. What do you say? Ready to become America's most unexpected legal defender. He adjusted his tie, his usual clumsiness briefly giving way to an air of purpose. Let's do it. But I still get to wear my cross, right? Absolutely, Sophie said with a smile. As the two walked away from the courthouse, the cameras continued to flash. But for once, Mr. Bean wasn't just a punchline. He was a symbol of something greater. A reminder that even the most underestimated people can change the system when they dare to speak up. And thus, with a heart full of courage and pockets full of random objects, Mr. Bean set out on a new journey, one where law and laughter would collide in ways no one could ever predict. Weeks after his courtroom triumph, Mr. Bean's life had taken a dramatic turn. Gone were the days of accidental chaos, well, mostly. Now his inbox overflowed with legal consultation requests and his mailbox brimmed with fan letters from people across the country who admired his quirky yet brilliant defense of personal freedom. One letter, however, stood out. It came from Mrs. Helen Cartwright, a retired schoolteacher from Ohio. She had been fined for wearing a small pin shaped like a dove, a symbol of peace, during a city council meeting. With trembling hands, she explained that the city claimed her pin violated public neutrality laws. Mr. Bean frowned as he read the letter. A dove? That's hardly threatening, he murmured, his heart warming to the idea of helping her. The next day, he found himself on a plane to Ohio, his cross necklace proudly displayed under his suit jacket. Sophie Harper, his new legal partner, met him at the airport. Are you sure you're ready for another fight? She asked as they navigated the bustling terminal. Mr. Bean flashed a confident smile. Ready as I'll ever be. And this time I brought visual aids. He patted his briefcase, which clinked suspiciously with the sound of, well, who knows what. In the Ohio courtroom, the atmosphere buzzed with curiosity. Once again, the media had caught wind of the case, and people eagerly anticipated whether Mr. Bean would deliver another legal masterstroke or trip over his shoelaces. The city's lawyer, a stern woman named Ms. Davenport, wasted no time laying out her argument. Public symbols of belief, no matter how harmless they seem, can create an exclusionary environment. The law must apply equally to everyone, she said crisply. Mr. Bean rose slowly, his face unreadable. He shuffled his papers unnecessarily before leaning toward the microphone. Your Honor, he began, his voice unusually serious, I understand the city's concerns. After all, who knows what chaos might follow if someone wears a dove pin? His exaggerated tone earned a ripple of laughter through the gallery. Then, without warning, he snapped open his briefcase and pulled out a Rubik's Cube. Let's say this cube represents freedom, he said, spinning it slowly. When it's whole, it's colorful, every side expressing something unique. But if you enforce laws that strip away individuality, he twisted the cube violently until every side was monochromatic. You drain the world of its color. And who wants to live in a dull, gray world? Even Ms. Davenport looked momentarily disarmed by the metaphor. Sophie, watching from their table, whispered under her breath, he's doing it again. Mr. Bean wasn't done. He placed the scrambled cube in front of the judge. The law isn't supposed to make us all the same. It's supposed to protect our right to be different, whether that means wearing a cross necklace, a dove pin, or even, he pulled a smiley face button from his pocket. This little guy. Mr. Bean wasn't done. He placed the scrambled cube in front of the judge. The law isn't supposed to make us all the same. It's supposed to protect our right to be different, whether that means wearing a cross necklace, a dove pin, or even, he pulled a smiley face button from his pocket. This little guy. The judge, a kindly older man with silver hair, chuckled softly. Mr. Bean, are you suggesting the city's law is unconstitutional? Oh, absolutely, Mr. Bean said, his voice light but firm. If we start censoring harmless personal expressions, where does it end? Today it's a dove pin. Tomorrow, what banning people from wearing socks with cartoon characters? Laughter filled the courtroom. Even Ms. Davenport struggled to hide a smile. And, Mr. Bean added, leaning closer, if freedom of expression can survive me, Your Honor, I think it can survive anything. When the judge called for a recess, it took him only 30 minutes to deliver his verdict. I find the city's ordinance to be an overreach of power. The fine against Mrs. Cartwright is hereby dismissed. Furthermore, I recommend the city reconsider this policy to ensure it aligns with constitutional rights. The courtroom erupted in applause. Mr. Bean bowed dramatically before helping Mrs. Cartwright gather her things. Outside, reporters once again swarmed him. Mr. Bean, how does it feel to win 2 landmark cases in a row? One asked breathlessly. Honestly, he grinned. It's better than finding my lost teddy bear. Sophie laughed, shaking her head. You're impossible, you know that? And proud of it, he quipped, adjusting his cross necklace as it gleamed in the sunlight. That evening, as Mr. Bean and Sophie sat at a diner celebrating their victory with milkshakes, she grew thoughtful. You know, she mused, with your legal mind and my, let's say, ability to translate Beanisms, we could really make a difference. What do you think about opening our own legal firm? Mr. Bean nearly choked on his milkshake. Us? A law firm. Why not? Sophie leaned in with a smile. We'll call it Bean and Harper, legal oddities specializing in cases nobody else would touch. Misfits defending the misjudged. It fits you perfectly. For once, Mr. Bean didn't hesitate. I love it, he declared, already picturing the chaos and justice they could bring to the world. And so, with a heart full of mischief and a mind sharper than anyone realized, Mr. Bean stepped into his new life, not just as a lovable oddball, but as America's most unpredictable legal genius. Because when it comes to the law, as Mr. Bean had proven, sometimes all it takes to change the world is a little humor, a lot of heart, and a perfectly placed cross necklace.